Welcome to Cheat Signal. Have you ever experienced a moment so profound, so inexplicably powerful, that it fundamentally altered the entire course of your existence? A moment that arrived unannounced, wrapped in darkness and uncertainty, yet carried within it the seeds of transformation? In today's video, I'm going to share with you a story that defies logical explanation. A story about loyalty that transcends species, about connection that pierces through the veil of loneliness, and about how sometimes salvation arrives on four legs when we least expect it but need it most desperately. This is the story of how a nameless Doberman, abandoned beneath an ancient oak tree on the coldest night of my life, became the guardian who stood between me and absolute destruction. This isn't just another heartwarming pet story. This is about survival, about recognizing grace when it appears in unexpected forms, and about the mysterious threads that bind souls together across impossible circumstances. Stay with me until the very end, because what I'm about to share will challenge everything you think you understand about fate, purpose, and the profound impact one being can have on another. Let's begin. For most of my adult life, I operated under a specific set of assumptions about the world and my place within it. I believed in measurable outcomes, in cause and effect, in the rational progression of events that could be explained, categorized, and understood through logic alone. Among those assumptions was a particularly limiting belief about animals and their role in human experience. I genuinely thought that dogs, while certainly pleasant companions and sources of comfort, couldn't possibly serve as genuine catalysts for fundamental human transformation. I saw them as additions to life, not as essential elements capable of redirecting its entire trajectory. I was wrong. Spectacularly, completely, irrevocably wrong. The night that belief shattered wasn't marked by thunder or dramatic signs. There were no omens, no warnings, no preparation for what was about to unfold. It was simply a Tuesday evening in late autumn, when the temperature had dropped suddenly and the world seemed to contract into itself, waiting. I had been walking for hours by that point, moving through the city without destination or purpose, carrying within me a heaviness that had been accumulating for months. Perhaps years. It was the kind of weight that doesn't announce itself loudly but instead seeps into your bones gradually, until one day you realize you can barely remember what it felt like to move through the world without it. Loneliness has a particular quality when it reaches a certain depth. It stops being about the absence of people and becomes about the absence of connection, of being truly seen, of mattering in any meaningful way to anyone or anything. I was surrounded by millions of people in that city, yet I had never felt more invisible, more fundamentally alone. The park appeared before me like an island in the darkness, its perimeter marked by old street lamps that cast pools of amber light onto rain-slicked pathways. Most people avoided this area after sunset. It had a reputation, whispers of danger that kept the cautious away. But I had long since stopped being cautious. When you stop caring about your own safety, when the prospect of harm carries no more weight than the prospect of continued emptiness, you walk through places others flee. That's when I saw him. At first, he was nothing more than a silhouette beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree that stood sentinel at the park's eastern edge. The tree itself must have been 100 years old, its trunk thick and gnarled, its branches reaching upward and outward like the arms of something trying to embrace the sky. And beneath those branches, absolutely motionless, sat a shape that gradually resolved into the form of a dog as I moved closer. Not just any dog. A Doberman pinscher. Even from a distance, I could sense the power contained within that muscular frame. Dobermans carry themselves with a particular dignity, an almost regal bearing that speaks to centuries of breeding for strength, intelligence, and protective instinct. This one was no exception. As I approached, details emerged from the darkness. His coat, despite being soaked through with rain, held that distinctive pattern of blacks and deep rust browns that make the breed so visually striking. His ears stood alert, triangular and precise, catching every sound that drifted through the night air. His body was lean but powerful, every muscle defined beneath wet fur, speaking of an animal in his prime despite the circumstances that had brought him to this abandoned place. But it was his eyes that stopped me in my tracks. I've looked into the eyes of many animals throughout my life, and most carry a certain recognizable quality: curiosity, fear, aggression, playfulness. This Doberman's eyes held something I had never encountered before and struggle even now to adequately describe. They were dark, nearly black in the dim light, and they fixed upon me with an intensity that felt almost human in its depth. There was no aggression there, no fear, no uncertainty. Instead, there was a kind of ancient knowing, as though this creature was reading not just my physical presence but the entirety of my emotional state, the accumulated grief and exhaustion I carried, the quiet desperation that had brought me wandering through dangerous places at dangerous hours. He didn't move. Didn't bark or growl. Didn't display any of the defensive behaviors I would have expected from a stray dog confronted by a stranger. He simply watched me with that unervingly calm, unervingly intelligent gaze. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to turn around, to walk away, to avoid potential danger. Dobermans have a reputation, deserved or not, as guard dogs, as breeds capable of significant aggression when threatened. Approaching an unknown dog of any breed in a dark, isolated location violates every common-sense rule of urban survival. But something deeper than rationality was operating in that moment. Some instinct that predates language and logic, some ancient form of recognition that exists beneath the surface of conscious thought, whispered a different message: this matters. This moment matters. Don't walk away. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of sound that isolated us from the rest of the world. The street lamp above flickered, causing shadows to dance across the wet pavement. In that unstable light, with water streaming down my face and soaking through my jacket, I made a decision that would alter the fundamental trajectory of my existence. I lifted my hand. It was a simple gesture, palm open, fingers slightly curved, offered at waist height with my body positioned at a slight angle to appear less threatening. Every muscle in my body tensed, prepared for flight if necessary, heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. The Doberman's eyes shifted from my face to my extended hand. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Rain fell. Shadows moved. And then, with deliberate slowness, he stood. His movements were fluid despite the obvious strength they contained, each step measured and precise as he closed the distance between us. 3 steps. 4. 5. Until his powerful head was inches from my still extended hand. I felt his breath first, warm despite the cold, carrying the earthy scent of wet fur and rain-soaked ground. Then came the touch. His nose pressed gently against my palm, wet and cold, exploring with careful deliberation. A moment of assessment. A moment of decision. And then, so subtly I almost missed it, his tail moved. Not a full wag, not an expression of excitement or joy, but a small, controlled movement that spoke of cautious acceptance. Something inside me, something that had been clenched tight for longer than I could remember, suddenly loosened. It felt like a lock turning, like a door I didn't know existed swinging slowly open to reveal light on the other side. My fingers, trembling slightly, moved to rest on the top of his head. His fur was coarse and wet, but beneath it I could feel the warmth of his skin, the solid reality of his presence. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, pressing his considerable weight gently against my legs in a gesture that felt shockingly intimate, shockingly trusting. I knelt down then, no longer caring about the wet ground or the cold or the impropriety of kneeling before a strange dog in a dangerous park at night. Nothing mattered except this moment, this connection, this inexplicable sense that something important was happening, something I didn't yet understand but could feel in every cell of my body. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, my voice rough with emotions I couldn't name. "Where did you come from?" He offered no answer, of course. Dogs don't speak in words. But his eyes, still locked on mine with that unsettling depth, seemed to communicate something nonetheless. A message I would only fully comprehend in the days to come, as the truth of that night slowly revealed itself. There was no collar around his powerful neck. No tags, no identification, no sign that he belonged to anyone or anywhere. Just a magnificent animal, alone in the darkness, waiting beneath an ancient tree as though he had been placed there specifically for this moment, specifically for me. I stayed with him for over an hour that first night, sitting in the cold rain, occasionally touching his fur, mostly just existing in the same space, sharing a silence that felt more comfortable than any conversation I'd had with another human being in months. When I finally forced myself to stand and walk away, it felt like leaving part of myself behind. With every step that carried me away from that oak tree, the hollow space in my chest seemed to grow larger, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. I went home to my small apartment, showered off the rain and the cold, changed into dry clothes, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling as dawn gradually lightened the windows. Sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, that powerful silhouette, those knowing eyes, the gentle press of his nose against my palm. The entire next day passed in a blur of mechanical actions. I went through the motions of work, of eating, of existing, but my mind remained in that park, beneath that tree, with that dog whose presence had somehow carved itself into my consciousness in a way I couldn't explain and didn't fully understand. By evening, the pull had become irresistible. I wasn't guided by logic or reason. I was operating on pure instinct, following an internal compass that insisted, with growing urgency, that I had to return. That I had to know if he was still there. That I had to see if what I'd felt the previous night had been real or simply a product of exhaustion and loneliness. The walk to the park felt longer than it had the night before, every step weighted with anticipation and a fear I didn't want to acknowledge, the fear that he wouldn't be there, that the moment had passed, that I'd missed some crucial opportunity one couldn't quite define. But as I rounded the corner and the old oak tree came into view, my breath caught in my throat. He was there. Same spot, same posture, sitting with his back straight and his head held high, silhouetted against the darkening sky like a statue carved from shadow and patience. And when he saw me, when his eyes found mine across the distance, something happened that sent a shockwave through my entire system. His tail lifted. And began to wag. Not cautiously this time. Not with the measured uncertainty of the previous night. This was genuine recognition, genuine response to my presence. He remembered me. In the 24 hours since our first encounter, in all the thousands of people who might have passed through that park, in all the sensory information his powerful mind had processed, he had retained something specific about me. About that moment we'd shared. I had mattered to him. The realization hit me with unexpected force, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. When was the last time anyone had reacted to my arrival with such uncomplicated gladness? When was the last time my presence had generated such a pure, positive response in another living being? I crossed the remaining distance at a pace somewhere between a walk and a run, and he stood to meet me, his tail now wagging with full enthusiasm, his entire body language speaking of welcome. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, my voice breaking slightly as I dropped to my knees before him. "You waited for me." He stepped forward and gently, with infinite care, rested his massive head against my knee. The weight of it, the warmth of it, the simple trust contained in that gesture, broke something open inside me that I hadn't even realized was sealed shut. I wrapped my arms around his neck, burying my face in his fur, and for the first time in years, actual years, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the loneliness I'd been carrying. And in feeling it, in acknowledging it, in sharing the burden of it with this silent, powerful creature who asked nothing of me except that I be present, I felt it begin to lighten. We stayed like that for a long time, two beings worn down by their respective journeys, finding unexpected refuge in each other's presence. He didn't demand conversation or explanation. He didn't judge the tears that fell silently into his fur. He simply existed beside me, solid and real and undeniably present, offering a form of acceptance I hadn't known I desperately needed. That night established a pattern that would continue for weeks. Every evening after work, regardless of weather or fatigue or any of the 100 small excuses I could have invented, I returned to that park. And every evening, he was there, waiting beneath our oak tree as though guarding some sacred space that existed only for the two of us. I began bringing food, quality dog food purchased during hurried lunch breaks, along with collapsible water bowls and occasionally treats that I had no idea whether he'd enjoy. He accepted everything with dignified gratitude, never rushing or grabbing, always waiting for my signal that it was okay to eat. And I talked. Oh, how I talked. I told him things I had never spoken aloud to another soul. The disappointments of my career, the betrayals of past relationships, the slow accumulation of losses and failures that had brought me to that park on that first rainy night. The fears that kept me awake. The regrets that haunted my quiet moments. The persistent, pervasive sense that I had somehow missed the turn that would have led to a meaningful life. He listened with an attention no human had ever offered me. His eyes never wavered from my face. His body remained still and focused, every part of him oriented toward me as though my words were the most important sounds in the world. There's something profoundly healing about being heard without judgment, without interruption, without someone immediately trying to fix or minimize or redirect your pain. He offered no solutions because he understood instinctively that I didn't need solutions. I needed witness. I needed someone to acknowledge that my experience was real, that my pain mattered, that I existed in a way that registered significance in the universe. One night, perhaps 3 weeks into our established routine, I finally asked the question that had been sitting on my tongue since that first encounter. Do you have a home? Does someone miss you when you're out here? I'd looked for signs, of course. Checked local lost pet boards, scrolled through social media posts about missing dogs, even called a few animal shelters to see if anyone had reported a missing Doberman. Nothing. No one looking for him. No one claiming him. He held my gaze as I asked, steady and calm, and gave no indication one way or another. I let out a small breath, heavy with recognition. Yeah, I whispered. Me neither. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? I had an apartment, 4 walls, a roof, furniture, all the physical components that technically constituted a residence. But it wasn't a home. It had never been a home. It was just a place where I stored my body between the hours I was required to be elsewhere. Home suggests belonging, warmth, connection, purpose. Home means you matter to the space and the space matters to you. By that definition, I'd been homeless for years, just in a more socially acceptable form than what most people recognize as homelessness. But sitting there in the cold wind, my fingers buried in his warm fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, experiencing the profound comfort of his presence, that felt like home in a way nothing else had in longer than I could remember. I think, I told him quietly, that you might be saving me. His tail gave a small wag, and he pressed his head more firmly against my chest, as though confirming what I'd just said. I wasn't rescuing him, I realized with sudden clarity. He was rescuing me. But fate, as I've learned, operates on its own schedule. It waits for precisely the right moment to reveal why certain beings enter our lives, why certain connections form despite all logic and probability. That moment came on a Thursday night. I remember the day with perfect clarity because it had been particularly brutal at work. A major project had collapsed due to factors beyond my control, and I'd spent hours being blamed for failures that weren't mine, absorbing criticism from people who had no idea what I'd actually contributed, feeling that familiar sense of invisibility and insignificance that I'd been fighting against for so long. By the time I left the office, I was completely drained emotionally, mentally, physically. The kind of exhausted that makes your body feel heavy and your thoughts sluggish. I almost didn't go to the park that night. Almost convinced myself it would be acceptable to skip just this once, to go straight home and collapse into bed. But the thought of disappointing him, of breaking our routine, of not being there when he was certainly waiting, gave me just enough energy to make my feet move in the right direction. The streets were unusually quiet that night. Fewer cars than normal. Fewer pedestrians. The kind of stillness that usually precedes something significant, though you only recognize it in retrospect. When I reached the park entrance, something felt different. The air had a quality I couldn't quite name, a tension, an expectancy, like the atmosphere before a storm breaks. The street lamps seemed dimmer than usual, their light struggling to push back the darkness that pooled in the spaces between. He was there, of course. Always there. But even from a distance, I could see that something was wrong. His body was rigid in a way I'd never witnessed before. Every muscle appeared coiled, tense, ready. His ears were sharply forward, his tail straight and still. And his eyes, those eyes that usually softened when they saw me, were hard, focused, locked onto something behind me with laser intensity. A cold ripple of fear ran down my spine. I turned slowly, following his gaze. A man stood approximately 20 feet away, positioned beneath one of the broken street lamps that had been out for weeks, drenched in shadow. His hood was pulled low over his face. His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking. Just standing there. Staring. At me. Every instinct I possessed suddenly screamed danger. This wasn't a random pedestrian passing through. This wasn't someone who happened to be in the same space by coincidence. The way he stood, the way he watched, the way he'd positioned himself, it all spoke of intention. Of planning. Of threat. My body froze. My mind raced through options, run, scream, try to talk my way out, pull out my phone, but fear had locked my muscles in place. I stood there, trapped in the amber glow of the distant street lamp, unable to move, unable to think clearly, unable to do anything except stare back at the hooded figure who had somehow known I would be here, alone, vulnerable. Then I heard it. A growl. Not the playful rumble of a dog at play. Not the uncertain warning of a nervous animal. This was something primal, something that reached back through thousands of years of evolution to when wolves hunted in packs and survival meant knowing when to fight. The sound came from deep in the Doberman's chest, resonating through the night air like a physical force. It was pure instinct, pure warning, pure protective rage distilled into sound. The man took a step forward. And the Doberman moved. I had never seen him like this. All the gentleness, all the calm, all the patient stillness that had defined our interactions vanished in an instant, replaced by something ancient and absolutely certain. He positioned himself directly between me and the stranger, his body a living shield, every ounce of his considerable power focused and ready. His hackles rose, making him appear even larger. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that had been hidden behind his gentle expressions for all these weeks. His eyes never left the stranger's face. The message was unmistakable: you will not touch her. You will have to go through me first. The hooded man faltered. Whatever he'd planned, whatever he'd intended when he'd positioned himself in that darkened space, clearly hadn't accounted for this magnificent animal standing between him and his target. The Doberman took another step forward, closing the distance, his growl intensifying. Then he barked, a single, sharp, explosive sound that shattered the night's stillness like a gunshot. The man flinched visibly. For a long moment, the three of us remained frozen in this tableau: predator, protector, and protected. The only movement came from the Doberman's heaving chest and the slow, deliberate way he was advancing, inch by inch, toward the threat. Then the man broke. He took 2 quick steps backward, then turned and disappeared into the darkness between buildings, his footsteps rapidly fading until the night swallowed them completely. The Doberman stood absolutely still for several long seconds, his body still tense, still ready, making certain the threat had truly passed. Only when he was completely satisfied that the danger had gone did he turn back to me. And found me collapsed on my knees, shaking violently, hands pressed against my mouth, tears streaming down my face as the full reality of what had almost happened crashed over me like a wave. He came to me immediately, pressing his body against mine, offering his solid weight as an anchor. I wrapped my arms around his neck and held on as though he were the only thing keeping me tethered to the earth, held on while my body shook with fear and shock and a gratitude so intense it felt like pain. "Thank you," I whispered against his fur, my voice broken and raw. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." He stood absolutely still, supporting my weight, his breathing slowly returning to normal. One of his paws lifted slightly and rested against my leg in a gesture I'd seen him make before, his way of offering comfort, of saying "I'm here, you're safe." And I knew, with absolute certainty, 3 things. First, that man had meant me harm. Real, significant harm. Second, that the Doberman had not only recognized the threat but had been prepared to fight to the death to protect me from it. And third, that I owed this magnificent creature my life. We stayed like that for a long time, me crying silently into his fur, him standing guard, occasionally glancing toward the space where the stranger had disappeared to ensure he didn't return. The fear gradually drained from my body, replaced by something else. Something fierce and profound. Love. Not the romantic kind, not the familial kind, but something perhaps more fundamental. The love that exists between beings who have witnessed each other's truth, who have stood together against darkness, who have formed a bond that transcends the usual boundaries between species. When I finally found the strength to stand, my legs shaky and uncertain beneath me, he stayed pressed against my side, supporting me. And when I took that first step away from the park, heading toward the safety of populated streets and lit windows, he didn't wait at the oak tree. He walked beside me. Step for step, his powerful shoulder aligned with my leg, he shadowed me through the streets. Not following, accompanying. There's a difference. Following suggests hierarchy, distance. Accompanying suggests partnership. We walked the entire journey to my apartment in silence, and when we reached my building's entrance, I turned to look at him. Really look at him. This creature who had somehow known I would need him, who had waited patiently for weeks while we built trust, who had just placed himself between me and violence without a moment's hesitation. "I can't leave you out here anymore," I said quietly. "Not after what you just did for me." He sat down on the doorstep and looked up at me with those impossibly deep eyes. Calm. Patient. Waiting for my decision, not demanding anything, but clearly willing to follow wherever I led. I opened the door. "Come on, then." He stood and walked through the threshold as though he'd always belonged there, as though this moment had been inevitable from that first rainy night beneath the oak tree. And just like that, everything changed. The apartment that had felt like an empty box for so long transformed overnight into something else entirely. A home. A real home, with weight and presence and purpose. That first night, he chose to sleep by the front door, positioning himself between the entrance and the rest of the apartment in a protective stance that didn't relax even in sleep. I understood. He was still on guard, still protecting me, unable to fully let down his defenses. I sat beside him for hours, my back against the wall, my hand resting on his side, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. The reality of what had almost happened in the park kept washing over me in waves, how close I'd come to becoming a statistic, a headline, a cautionary tale. How this animal, who I'd known for mere weeks, had valued my life enough to risk his own without hesitation. "I owe you everything," I whispered into the quiet darkness. He lifted his head and, with deliberate gentleness, placed his large paw on my knee. Such a simple gesture, but it felt like a vow being made. A promise carved in stone. "I will protect you. Always." From that night forward, our bond fused into something unbreakable. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I never did, and took him to a veterinarian. I needed to know that he was healthy, that he had no injuries or illnesses that needed attention, that he was strong and well despite his time living rough in the park. The vet was amazed by his condition. "Whoever had him before took excellent care of him," she said, running her hands over his muscular frame, checking teeth and eyes and coat. "He's in remarkable shape for a dog who's been living as a stray." But there was no microchip. No tattoo. No identifying markers at all. I put up posters anyway, covering a 6-block radius around the park, describing him in detail and providing my contact information. I posted on every lost and found pet forum I could locate. I called every shelter within a 30-mile radius to report that I'd found him. Nothing. No one claimed him. No one even called. After 2 weeks of diligent searching for an owner who might be missing him, I made it official. I named him Shadow, for the way he'd emerged from darkness that first night, and for the way he now followed me through every moment of every day, a constant presence just at the edge of my vision. I bought him everything he could possibly need. A proper dog bed, though he preferred sleeping on the floor beside my bed where he could keep watch over the room. Quality food that he accepted with dignified gratitude. Toys that he largely ignored, preferring instead to simply be near me, to rest his head on my lap while I read or watched television, to accompany me on walks through safer neighborhoods where the threat of danger felt distant and abstract. But more than the physical things, I gave him something else, purpose. Because I realized, as the weeks turned into months, that Shadow didn't want to be pampered or babied or treated like a pet in the conventional sense. He wanted to work. He wanted to protect. He wanted to fulfill the drive that had been bred into his lineage for generations. So I let him. When we walked through the city streets, I never shortened his lead unnecessarily or pulled him close out of nervousness. I trusted him to assess threats, to position himself appropriately, to be my guardian in the way he so clearly needed to be. And he took that responsibility with absolute seriousness. His awareness was constant and comprehensive. His eyes tracked every person who approached, every unusual sound, every change in the environment. Not with paranoia, but with professional attention. He knew the difference between normal urban activity and genuine threat, and he adjusted his posture and position accordingly. People gave us a wide berth when they saw him walking beside me, and I didn't mind. His presence created a bubble of safety around us that I had never experienced before. For the first time in my adult life, I walked through the city without fear, without constantly looking over my shoulder, without carrying keys between my knuckles as an improvised weapon. Shadow became more than my companion. He became my anchor, my purpose, the center around which my days organized themselves. I started waking earlier to ensure he got proper exercise before I left for work. I came home immediately afterward, no longer lingering in the office or accepting half-hearted invitations to after-work drinks with colleagues I didn't particularly like. My apartment went from being a place I avoided to being the destination I looked forward to, because Shadow was there waiting, his tail wagging at the sound of my key in the lock. My mental health, which had been deteriorating for years, began to stabilize. The dark thoughts that had plagued me, the sense of worthlessness and purposelessness that had driven me to wander dangerous parks at dangerous hours, gradually receded. Not completely, healing isn't linear, and darkness doesn't vanish just because a dog enters your life. But Shadow gave me a reason to take care of myself. Because if I didn't take care of myself, I couldn't properly take care of him. If I didn't eat, I'd be too weak to walk him properly. If I didn't sleep, I'd be too impaired to notice if he needed something. My well-being became important not for my own sake, I still struggled with that, but for his. And in taking care of him, I learned to take care of myself. Friends I hadn't seen in months started commenting on the change. "You seem different," they'd say, trying to identify what had shifted. "Lighter, somehow. Like something that was weighing you down isn't there anymore." And they were right. Shadow had lifted a burden I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to exist without it. The burden of loneliness, of isolation, of being fundamentally disconnected from other living beings. He had reminded me what it felt like to matter to someone, to be needed, to have your presence generate joy and comfort rather than indifference. We developed routines and rituals. Every morning, before I got ready for work, we'd sit together on the small balcony of my apartment, watching the city wake up. He'd rest his head on my knee and I'd stroke his ears, both of us existing in comfortable silence as the sky lightened and the sounds of traffic gradually increased. Every evening, regardless of weather, we'd take a long walk, not back to the park where we'd met, but through different neighborhoods, exploring the city together, discovering green spaces and quiet streets I'd never bothered to notice before. And every night, before sleep, I'd kneel beside him and press my forehead against his, speaking in whispers the gratitude that never diminished. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for being you. Life became something other than mere existence. It became worth living. But as anyone who has loved deeply knows, time is the cruelest thief. The first signs were so subtle I almost missed them. Shadow had always moved with fluid grace despite his size, his powerful muscles propelling him effortlessly through space. But one evening, about 2 years after he'd walked through my door, I noticed him hesitate slightly before jumping up onto the couch beside me, a jump he'd made thousands of times without thought. It was barely noticeable. Just a fractional pause, a moment of calculation that hadn't been there before. I told myself I was imagining things, reading meaning into nothing. But the signs accumulated. His breaths began to sound heavier after our walks, even when we hadn't gone particularly far or fast. He started sleeping more deeply, to the point where sometimes I'd have to gently shake him awake rather than him instantly alert at my approach. Small things. Tiny shifts in behavior that could have meant nothing. But meant everything. I took him back to the vet, my stomach tight with dread I didn't want to acknowledge. She was thorough, running every test, examining him with care and attention. And when she finally sat down across from me in the small consultation room, her face carried an expression I'd learned to recognize from other difficult moments in my life. The expression that precedes bad news. Shadow is getting older, she said gently. He's what we'd estimate to be around 9 or 10 years old now. For a Doberman of his size, that's approaching senior status. And unfortunately, the breed is predisposed to certain heart conditions that typically emerge in their later years. The words washed over me, but my brain refused to process them properly. Older. Senior. Heart conditions. All of those words meant the same thing, ultimately. They meant time. They meant endings. They meant loss. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated. It's impossible to say definitively. With medication and careful management, he could have several good years left. But we need to be realistic about the trajectory. His heart is already showing signs of weakness. We'll do everything we can to keep him comfortable and extend his quality time, but... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I left the clinic with a bag full of medications and supplements, with instructions about reduced exercise and careful monitoring, with pamphlets about managing senior dogs with heart disease. Shadow walked beside me, oblivious to the conversation that had just taken place, his tail wagging gently, content simply to be moving through the world with me. And I broke. Not there on the street, I held myself together through sheer force of will until we reached the apartment. But once we were safely inside, with the door closed and locked, I sank down onto the floor and let the grief crash over me. Shadow immediately came to me, pressing his body against mine, his warm weight settling across my lap. He licked the tears from my face with gentle precision, whining softly in concern, trying to understand why I was upset, trying to make it better the only way he knew how, through presence, through touch, through unwavering solidarity. I can't lose you, I whispered against his fur. I can't. You saved me. You gave me a reason to keep going. How am I supposed to do this without you? He had no answer, of course. He simply stayed close, offering what he always offered, absolute, unconditional presence. The months that followed were bittersweet in a way I'd never experienced before. Every day became precious, weighted with the knowledge that our time together had an expiration date I couldn't see but knew was approaching. I adjusted our routines to accommodate his changing needs. Shorter walks at a slower pace. More frequent rest breaks. Cushioned beds in every room so he'd always have a comfortable place to lie down. I learned to read the subtle signs that indicated he was having a difficult day versus a good day, adjusting our activities accordingly. But even as his physical strength gradually diminished, his spirit remained unchanged. His eyes still tracked my movements with devoted attention. His tail still wagged when I came home. He still positioned himself between me and any perceived threat, still took his role as my protector with absolute seriousness, even though he no longer had the physical capability to enforce that protection effectively. One evening, about 6 months after that vet appointment, we were sitting together on the balcony during what had become our sacred morning ritual. The sun was setting rather than rising. We'd gradually shifted the timing as Shadow's energy levels changed, and the sky was streaked with brilliant oranges and purples. Shadow's head rested heavily on my knee, his breathing audible and labored in a way that sent spikes of fear through my chest. I stroked his ears with gentle repetition, trying to memorize every detail, the silky texture of his coat, the weight of his head, the warmth of his body, the particular way he sighed when content. "You don't have to keep fighting," I whispered, giving voice to the thought I'd been carrying for weeks but couldn't bear to speak. "You don't have to stay strong for me anymore. You've done enough. You've done more than enough." His eyes opened and found mine, and even weakened as he was, they still held that same depth, that same intelligence, that same fierce devotion that had defined him from that very first night. He was still holding on for me. Still trying to be my protector, my guardian, my anchor, even as his own body failed him. The tears came then, unstoppable. "It's okay," I told him, my voice breaking. "You can rest now. You've earned your rest. And I promise that I'll be okay. You taught me how to be okay. You taught me that I matter, that life is worth living, that connection is possible. I'll carry that with you. I'll carry you with me. Always." His tail moved slightly. A tiny wag, barely visible, but there. And in his eyes, I saw understanding. Permission. Release. That night, he slept more deeply than usual, his body curled in his favorite spot beside my bed where he'd slept for over 2 years. I stayed awake, my hand resting on his side, feeling each breath, counting them like precious treasures because some part of me knew, just knew, that we were approaching the end. When morning came, he didn't wake up. The grief was unlike anything I'd experienced before. When humans die, we have funerals and rituals, structures of mourning that society recognizes and accommodates. When a pet dies, the world expects you to recover quickly. It was just a dog, people say, meaning well but understanding nothing. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was the being who saved my life in the most literal sense possible. He was the force that pulled me back from the edge of despair and gave me a reason to continue existing. He was my protector, my companion, my purpose, my home. He was half my heart, and now that half was simply gone. The apartment felt impossibly empty. Every corner held his absence. The spot beside my bed where he'd slept. The door where he'd positioned himself as guardian. The balcony where we'd shared countless quiet mornings. All empty now. All echoing with loss. I couldn't bring myself to remove his things for weeks. His bed remained in the corner of my room. His water bowl stayed filled. His collar hung from the hook where I'd placed it that very first day he came home with me. Slowly, painfully, I learned to navigate the world without him. The walks became solitary again, but I forced myself to take them anyway, remembering how he'd taught me to move through the city with less fear. The mornings on the balcony continued, though now I sat alone, speaking to his memory rather than his physical presence. And gradually, something unexpected happened. I realized he hadn't left. Not completely. He was woven into who I had become. Every confident step I took through formerly frightening spaces, that was him. Every moment I chose connection over isolation, that was him. every time I looked at another living being with compassion rather than indifference, that was him. Shadow had fundamentally altered my neural pathways, my behavioral patterns, my understanding of what it means to be connected to another soul. That kind of change doesn't disappear when the physical body does. It remains, permanent and undeniable, a legacy carved into the architecture of the self. Some bonds, I learned, don't fade with death. They don't weaken or diminish. They transform. They become part of your story, part of your identity, part of the lens through which you see and interpret the world. Shadow would walk beside me for the rest of my life, not in body but in impact, not in presence but in principle. 6 months after he died, I finally felt ready to return to that park. To that oak tree where we'd first met on that cold, rainy night that now felt like a lifetime ago. I stood beneath those sprawling branches, looking at the spot where he'd sat with such patient dignity, waiting for someone who needed him to finally arrive. And I understood something I'd been too consumed by grief to see clearly before. Our meeting wasn't coincidence. I don't know if I believe in fate in the traditional sense, in some cosmic plan laid out in advance. But I believe in timing. I believe in need meeting fulfillment. I believe that sometimes, when we're at our most desperate, most broken, most convinced that nothing will ever change, the universe, through whatever mechanism we choose to name, sends us exactly what we need to survive. Shadow had been my exactly what I needed. And I had been his. Because rescuing isn't a one-way transaction. I may have given him food and shelter and safety, but he gave me purpose and protection and proof that I mattered. We saved each other, two lost souls finding refuge in unexpected connection. I placed my hand on the trunk of the oak tree, feeling the rough bark beneath my palm, and whispered into the evening air, "Thank you. For sending him to me. For those precious years. For teaching me that love doesn't require words, that loyalty is a choice renewed every single day, that protecting someone else is the highest form of purpose." A breeze moved through the branches above, rustling leaves in a sound that almost resembled breath. And for just a moment, I felt him there beside me. Not as memory or imagination, but as presence. As certainty. He hadn't abandoned me. He had simply changed form. As I stand here today, years removed from that transformative encounter beneath an oak tree in a dangerous park, I carry Shadow with me in everything I do. I volunteer now at animal shelters, helping to care for dogs who are waiting for their person to find them. I walk through the world with less fear and more compassion. I've built connections with other humans that I never would have pursued before, relationships built on the template Shadow showed me: presence, loyalty, unconditional acceptance. The apartment that once felt like an empty box is now truly a home, filled with the energy of life worth living. And yes, eventually, when the grief had softened enough to make space for new love without feeling like betrayal, I adopted another dog. Not a replacement for Shadow, there could never be a replacement, but a new being with their own story, their own needs, their own gifts to offer. And in caring for this new soul, I honor what Shadow taught me about the transformative power of showing up, of staying present, of loving without condition. People sometimes ask me if I believe in miracles. I tell them yes. Absolutely yes. Because what else do you call it when exactly the right being appears at exactly the right moment? When a creature who speaks no words manages to communicate the most important message you'll ever receive? When love arrives on 4 legs and changes everything? That's not luck. That's not coincidence. That's grace. Shadow taught me that we're never as alone as we think we are. That help often arrives in forms we don't expect. That the beings who save us might not look like saviors until we're desperately enough to see them clearly. He taught me that home isn't a place. It's a presence. He taught me that protection isn't about physical strength. It's about unwavering commitment to another's well-being. He taught me that love doesn't require perfection. It requires showing up. Again and again and again. So if you've ever experienced a connection like this, one that changed you in ways you still can't fully articulate, one that reached into the deepest parts of who you are and shifted something fundamental, I want you to know that you're not alone in that experience. And if you're still waiting for your moment, for your encounter, for the being or experience that will tilt the axis of your world, keep faith. Keep showing up. Keep remaining open to possibilities. Because sometimes salvation wears a coat of black and rust. Sometimes it has 4 legs and eyes that see straight through to your soul. Sometimes it waits beneath an oak tree in the rain, patient and certain, knowing that eventually, the person who needs it most will finally arrive. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Through Shadow's story. Through our story. If you've experienced something similar, a pet or person or moment that fundamentally changed your trajectory, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Your story matters. Your experience matters. Someone reading this might need to hear it more than you know. And if you want to see more content about the profound connections between humans and animals, about finding purpose in unexpected places, about healing through relationship, make sure to subscribe to Cheat Signal and hit that notification bell. Until next time, hold tight to the beings who make your life feel worth living. Honor the connections that save you. And never underestimate the power of showing up, even when, especially when, you don't think you have anything left to give. Because sometimes, in giving what little we have, we receive everything we never knew we needed. This is Cheat Signal, reminding you that the most powerful forces in our lives often arrive silently, without announcement, and change everything. Take care of each other out there.